The desert stretched endlessly beneath the merciless August sun, its red rocks rising like ancient sentinels against the bleached sky. Heat waves danced across the barren landscape, distorting the distant mesas into shimmering mirages. The sparse grasses, yellowed and brittle from months without rain, crackled underfoot like old parchment. This was the Arizona Territory in 1863, a land as beautiful as it was deadly, where civilization's edge met the raw, untamed wilderness. A small wagon train had made camp just outside the settlement of Willow Creek, a dusty collection of adobe buildings that barely qualified as a town. The tension in the air was thicker than the desert heat for weeks. Rumors had circulated about Apache raids along the frontier, tales of burning homesteads and stolen livestock that made even the bravest men check their rifles twice before sleeping. Among the travelers was 17-year-old Eleanor Whitfield, her corn silk hair pinned beneath a simple bonnet, her blue eyes still holding the innocence of youth despite the hardships of the trail. She had left her family's farm in Missouri 3 months ago, accompanying her uncle's family west in search of new opportunities. It was her first time away from the gentle hills and green fields of home, and the harsh beauty of the desert both frightened and fascinated her. Eleanor helped her aunt prepare the evening meal, her hands steady despite the nervous chatter around the campfire. The men spoke in low voices about Apache sightings, about the need for extra guards, about pushing onto the fort by morning. Her uncle, Thomas Whitfield, cleaned his Spencer rifle with methodical care, his weathered face grim. "They say it's Cochise's band," muttered Jacob Morrison, a trader traveling with them. "Apaches don't usually come this far north, but something's got them stirred up." It's the soldiers," Thomas replied, spitting tobacco juice into the fire. "Army's been pushing them hard. Burning their rancherias makes them desperate." Eleanor listened while pretending to focus on her sewing. She had heard stories about the Apache, painted as savage demons who descended from the mountains like wolves. Yet, sometimes, in quiet moments, she wondered if they too had families, if their women worried about their men as she worried about her uncle. As darkness fell, the camp settled into an uneasy quiet. Eleanor lay on her bedroll inside the wagon, listening to the desert sounds, the distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of wind through the rocks, the soft nickering of the horses. She had just begun to doze when the first scream pierced the night. The attack came swift and terrible. Apache warriors materialized from the darkness like phantoms, their war cries splitting the air. Gunfire erupted from all directions. Eleanor scrambled from the wagon, her heart pounding as chaos engulfed the camp. Flames leaped from a neighboring wagon, casting dancing shadows across the horrific scene. "Eleanor, get back!" her uncle shouted, firing his rifle at shapes moving in the darkness. But in the confusion, she became separated from her family. Smoke stung her eyes as she stumbled between the wagons, searching desperately for her aunt. A hand suddenly clamped over her mouth, strong arms lifting her from the ground. She struggled wildly, her scream muffled against a calloused palm. Her captor smelled of smoke and leather, horse sweat and something wild. In her terror, she caught a glimpse of him, a young Apache warrior, his face painted with bold strokes of red and black, his dark eyes fierce with battle fury. He threw her across his horse and vaulted up behind her, his arm like an iron band around her waist. Eleanor's mind reeled with panic as the horse plunged into the darkness, leaving the burning camp behind. She could hear other horses following, the Apache warriors calling to each other in their guttural language. The night flight was a nightmare of jarring motion and fear. Eleanor forced herself to go limp, letting her body sway with the horse's movement, feigning unconsciousness. It was the only defense she could think of. Perhaps if they thought her senseless, they would leave her unharmed. She kept her breathing shallow, her eyes closed, even as tears leaked from beneath her lashes. The warrior behind her spoke sharply in Apache, and another responded with what sounded like surprise. Through her terror, Eleanor caught a word that sounded almost like daughter in Spanish. Had they mistaken her for someone else? Her pale hair, unusual even among whites, might have marked her as someone specific in the darkness and confusion. Miles passed beneath the horse's hooves. The sounds of pursuit, if there had been any, faded into nothing. Eleanor's body ached from maintaining her lifeless pose, but fear kept her still. The warrior's grip never loosened, though she felt him shift occasionally, perhaps checking if she had awakened. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, exhaustion overcame her act. Her body truly began to sag, and darkness crept into the edges of her consciousness. The last thing she remembered was the warrior's voice, speaking quietly to his companions, and the feeling of being lifted from the horse. When Eleanor next opened her eyes, she lay on a bed of pine boughs inside a brush shelter. Voices spoke outside in the Apache tongue, and through the entrance, she could see figures moving about a camp. Terror seized her anew, but she forced herself to remain still, to continue her pretense of sleep. A shadow fell across the entrance. The warrior who had taken her ducked inside, and for the first time, she saw him clearly in daylight. He was younger than she had thought, perhaps only a few years older than herself, with sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes that studied her with a mixture of suspicion and something else, curiosity. He wore a simple cloth shirt and leather leggings, a knife at his belt. He spoke to her in Apache, then in broken Spanish when she didn't respond. Eleanor kept her eyes closed, her breathing even, though her heart raced. After a moment, he left, and she heard him speaking to others outside. As the day wore on, Eleanor pieced together fragments of her situation through the conversations she could hear. The Apaches seemed to be arguing about her. An older voice, authoritative and harsh, spoke at length. The young warrior responded defensively. She caught that Spanish word again. Hija, daughter. It was then she understood. They had taken her believing she was someone else's daughter, perhaps the child of a trader or official who had wronged them. She was a prize, a bargaining tool, and her life hung on maintaining this mistaken identity. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Eleanor lay still on her bed of boughs, feigning sleep while her mind raced. She was alone, captive among the Apache, miles from any help. The words she had heard whispered around wagon train campfires echoed in her mind. The Apache took the young virgin by mistake. She feigned sleep, yet awoke carrying his child. But those were just stories, weren't they? Tales to frighten young women into staying close to camp. As darkness fell and the Apache began their evening preparations, Eleanor clung to her pretense of unconsciousness, knowing it was her only shield against whatever fate awaited her in this enemy camp. The young warrior returned once more as stars began to emerge in the desert sky. This time, he brought water in a gourd, setting it beside her. For a long moment, he stood watching her, and Eleanor fought to keep her breathing steady, her face relaxed. She heard him sigh, then speak softly in Apache, words that almost sounded gentle, though she couldn't understand them. When he left, Eleanor allowed herself the smallest sip of water, her throat parched from fear and the desert heat. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But for tonight, she would maintain her deception, sleeping among enemies while her family mourned her as lost or dead. In the distance, a coyote howled, and Eleanor Whitfield, proper young lady from Missouri, closed her eyes and prepared to survive however she must in this harsh and alien world. The journey deeper into Apache territory tested every ounce of Eleanor's resolve. For 3 days, they traveled through landscapes that shifted from desert valleys to pine-covered mountains, each mile taking her further from any hope of rescue. The sun scorched her fair skin despite the blanket someone had thrown over her shoulders. Dust clogged her throat, and her lips cracked from the dry air. Eleanor maintained her pretense of unconsciousness whenever they stopped. Though her body screamed in protest from the constant riding, she had learned the young warrior's name, Naiche, from the way others addressed him. He rode behind her always, his arm secure around her waist, occasionally offering water from his gourd when the others weren't watching too closely. The Apache band consisted of 12 warriors, their faces painted for war, their movements swift and sure through the difficult terrain. They spoke in their native tongue, punctuated by occasional laughter that seemed incongruous with Eleanor's terror. She caught fragments of Spanish mixed with Apache, gleaning that they were heading to their main camp, their rancheria, as she'd heard it called. On the fourth day, they descended into a hidden valley where the scent of pine and wood smoke announced their arrival before she saw the camp. Eleanor's heart sank as she glimpsed the collection of wickiups, dome-shaped brush shelters, scattered along a clear stream. Women and children emerged to greet the returning warriors, their voices rising in a mixture of welcome and curiosity. When Naichi lifted her from the horse, Eleanor let her body go completely limp, her head lolling as if in deep unconsciousness. He carried her to a wickiup set slightly apart from the others, laying her on a bed of grass and hides, through her lashes. She watched him speak to an older woman who studied Eleanor with sharp, suspicious eyes. The woman, later Eleanor learned she was called Dahlia by the Mexicans they traded with, spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing at Eleanor's pale hair and skin. Naichi responded firmly, and though Eleanor couldn't understand the words, she sensed he was defending his prize. Other women gathered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. When they finally left her alone, Eleanor cautiously opened her eyes to study her prison. The wickiup was surprisingly clean and comfortable, with baskets of dried food stacked against one wall and beautifully woven blankets folded nearby. Through the entrance, she could see the daily life of the Apache camp, children playing with dogs, women grinding corn on stone metats, men tending to horses and weapons. It was nothing like the savage encampment she had imagined from the stories told around wagon trains. There was order here, routine, even moments of tenderness as she watched mothers with their children. Yet Eleanor knew she remained in mortal danger, a captive among people who had every reason to hate whites. As evening approached, Naichi returned with food, a thin stew of meat and wild onions, some kind of flatbread, and pine nuts. He set it beside her and spoke softly in Spanish. "Eat. You need strength." Eleanor remained still, though her stomach cramped with hunger. She hadn't eaten properly in days, taking only small sips of water when absolutely necessary. Naiche sighed and left, but she noticed he positioned himself outside the wickiup, as if standing guard. That night, as the camp settled into sleep, Eleanor finally allowed herself to eat a few bites of the bread and drink some water. She had to maintain her strength if she hoped to escape. Through the smoke hole at the top of the wickiup, she could see stars, the same stars that shone over Willow Creek, where her aunt and uncle either mourned her or searched futilely for her trail. Days blended into a routine of careful deception. Each morning, Naiche would bring food and water. He would speak to her sometimes, mostly in broken Spanish, telling her she was safe, that no one would hurt her. Eleanor never responded, never opened her eyes in his presence, though she studied him carefully when he thought her unconscious. He was different from the bloodthirsty savage of her imagination. There was a dignity in his bearing, a careful grace in his movements. She watched him interact with the children who ran freely through the camp, saw him help an elderly man repair a bridle, observed the respect others showed him despite his youth. He was clearly a warrior of some standing, perhaps the son of a chief. The women of the camp were less gentle in their curiosity. They would enter the wickiup when Naichi was away, poking at Eleanor, speaking harshly in Apache, pulling at her hair and clothes. One woman, younger and beautiful with flashing dark eyes, seemed particularly hostile. Eleanor later understood this was Itza, who had expected to marry Naiche. It was during one of these visits that Eleanor's deception nearly failed. Itza yanked her hair so hard that tears sprang involuntarily to her eyes. Eleanor bit her lip until it bled to keep from crying out. The women laughed, but there was cruelty in it. They left only when Naichi's voice rang out sharply from outside. That evening, he examined the marks on her arms where the women had pinched her, his face darkening with anger. He spoke sternly to someone outside. and the harassment lessened, though the hostile looks continued. The camp's routines revealed themselves to Eleanor's careful observation. Morning brought the women to the stream for water, their voices carrying on the clear air. The men worked on weapons, trained horses, or left in hunting parties. Afternoon meant food preparation, the scent of cooking fires and roasting meat. Evening brought storytelling around the central fire, the sound of drums, sometimes dancing, that Eleanor watched through the entrance of her shelter. On her 7th day of captivity, a commotion arose in the camp. A party of warriors returned with news that sent ripples of excitement and concern through the people. Eleanor caught familiar words: soldiers, cavalry, mixed with the Apache tongue. The camp began preparations to move, women packing belongings with practiced efficiency. Naichi came to prepare her for travel, and for the first time, Eleanor saw uncertainty in his eyes. He wrapped her in a blanket, his hands surprisingly gentle, and spoke earnestly in Spanish. "We go to the mountains. Safe there. You are important. No harm comes to you." As he lifted her onto his horse, Eleanor wondered what he meant. Important how? As a hostage? As leverage against the approaching soldiers? She maintained her ruse of unconsciousness, but her mind raced with possibilities and fears about what would happen when her deception was inevitably discovered. The band moved swiftly through the night, their knowledge of the terrain evident in their sure navigation even in darkness. Eleanor clung to her pretense even as exhaustion made it easier to appear senseless. She felt Naichi's tension in the way he held her, the frequent glances he cast back along their trail. By dawn, they had reached a new camp higher in the mountains, where the air was thin and cold. Eleanor shivered despite the blanket, and Naichi pulled her closer against his chest, sharing his warmth. It was an oddly intimate gesture that sent an unwelcome flutter through her stomach. She pushed the feeling aside. He was her captor, her enemy. Any kindness was likely calculated, meant to ensure his valuable hostage survived. As they settled into the new camp, Eleanor heard raised voices. An argument had erupted between Naichi and an older warrior, their gestures indicating the dispute involved her. The older man pointed at Eleanor repeatedly, his tone harsh and demanding. Naichi stood his ground, his responses firm and unwavering. When the confrontation ended, Naichi stormed to the wickiup where Eleanor had been placed. Through her lashes, she saw his face, young, proud, troubled. He sat beside her still form and spoke quietly in Apache, words that sounded almost like a confession or perhaps a prayer. Then he switched to Spanish, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are not who they think. I know this, but if I say, they kill you. So you sleep, and I watch. This is all I can do." Eleanor's heart stopped. He knew she wasn't the person they'd meant to take, yet he was protecting her. Why? She remained perfectly still as he rose and left. But her mind churned with this new knowledge, her life balanced on the edge of a knife, dependent on the mercy of a young Apache warrior who had every reason to hate her kind. That night, as coyotes howled in the distant peaks and the campfire burned low, Eleanor lay awake, planning. She needed to escape before her pretense failed or Naichi's protection wavered. But how could she flee from people who knew these mountains like their own heartbeats? And why did the thought of leaving create an unexpected ache in her chest when she remembered the gentle way Naichi had shared his warmth against the mountain cold? Weeks passed in the mountain camp, and Eleanor's world narrowed to the rhythms of Apache life. Through her carefully maintained pretense, she observed everything. The way women gathered piñón nuts in woven baskets, how children learned to track small game, the reverence with which warriors tended their horses. Despite her captivity, she found herself oddly fascinated by these people who were so different from the savage caricatures she'd been taught to fear. Naichi had become her constant guardian, protecting her from the worst of the camp's hostility while maintaining a respectful distance. Each day, he brought her meals, fresh water, and occasionally small comforts. A softer blanket when the mountain nights grew cold, a handful of late-season berries, once even a small carved wooden comb for her tangled hair. Eleanor watched him when he thought her unconscious, studying this young man who held her life in his hands. He moved with the fluid grace of one born to this harsh land, equally comfortable breaking a wild horse or playing gently with his nephew, a boy of perhaps 5 summers. There was pride in his bearing, but also something else, a burden that seemed to weigh on him when he sat alone by the fire at night. She learned more of their language through constant exposure, though she dared not reveal this growing understanding. The Apache spoke of raids and soldiers, of diminishing game and encroaching settlements. They spoke of Naichi, too, with respect tinged with concern. He had not taken a wife, unusual for a warrior of his standing. Some whispered it was because of the white captive he guarded so jealously. One afternoon, while feigning sleep, Eleanor observed Naichi instructing young boys in the use of bow and arrow. His patience impressed her, the way he corrected their stance with gentle hands, his praise when they succeeded, when one boy's arrow flew true, striking the target. Naichi's face broke into a genuine smile that transformed his usually stern features. That evening, as he brought her meal, Eleanor made her first calculated mistake. A spider dropped from the wiki-up ceiling onto her face, and instinctively she flinched, her hand moving to brush it away before she caught herself. But it was too late. Naichi had seen. Their eyes met for one electric moment, his dark and knowing, hers wide with fear. Then, surprisingly, he simply reached over and gently brushed the spider away, his fingers barely grazing her cheek. "Spiders," he said quietly in Spanish. "Even sleeping women fear them." He left without another word, but Eleanor knew the dynamic had shifted. He was offering her a way to maintain her pretense, but they both now knew it for what it was, a mutual deception that kept her alive. Days later, Eleanor attempted her first escape. She had observed the guard patterns, noticed that in the pre-dawn hours, vigilance waned. Wrapped in a dark blanket, she crept from the wiki-up, her heart hammering against her ribs. The camp dogs, familiar with her scent now, merely watched as she slipped between the shelters. She had made it to the edge of camp when a figure materialized from the shadows. Not Naichi, one of the other warriors, older and crueler in countenance. He grabbed her roughly, speaking harsh words she didn't understand, though his intent was clear. Eleanor struggled, abandoning all pretense of unconsciousness. Naichi appeared as if summoned by her fear, his voice cracking like a whip across the darkness. The older warrior responded angrily, his grip tightening on Eleanor's arm. For a moment, violence hung in the air between the two men. Then Naichi spoke again, his tone deadly quiet, and the other warrior released her with a disgusted grunt. Without a word, Naichi grasped Eleanor's arm, firmly but not cruelly, and led her back to the wiki-up. Inside, he finally spoke, his Spanish colored with frustration. "Foolish woman, you think you can walk these mountains alone? The bears would find you, or the wolves, or worse, the soldiers who shoot first and ask no questions." "I am not meant to be here," Eleanor whispered, her voice hoarse from weeks of silence. "No," he agreed, "but here you are. And here you stay alive. Out there," he gestured beyond the camp. "Out there, you die." It was the longest conversation they'd had, and it left Eleanor shaken. She had revealed herself, broken her protective silence. Yet Naichi made no move to alert others, simply ensured she had water and an extra blanket before positioning himself outside her shelter for the remainder of the night. The failed escape attempt had consequences. The women of the camp, especially Itza, grew bolder in their torment. They would enter her wiki-up and speak rapidly in Apache, their tones mocking. Once, Itza grabbed Eleanor's face, forcing her to meet her eyes, and spoke slowly in broken English. "He, protect, you, why, you, nothing, white witch. When you die, he marry me." Eleanor remained silent, but she understood the threat. Her position was precarious, protected only by Naichi's intervention, and even he could not guard her every moment. The tension came to a head during a celebration. A successful raid had brought horses and supplies to the camp. Warriors danced around the fire, their bodies painted, their movements telling stories of courage and victory. Women joined them, and the sound of drums echoed off the mountain peaks. Eleanor watched through a gap in the wickiup covering as Nietzsche danced with the others. In the firelight, painted in the traditional way, he looked fierce and foreign. Yet, when a child stumbled near the fire, he was the first to sweep the boy to safety, his warrior's mask slipping to reveal concern. Later, when the celebration had quieted and most of the camp slept, Itza appeared in Eleanor's shelter. She was not alone. 2 other women accompanied her, their intentions clear. They pulled Eleanor from her bedding, dragging her outside despite her struggles. "Time! You! Learn! Place!" Itza hissed in her broken English. The women forced Eleanor toward the stream, and she understood with cold terror what they intended. Some form of punishment or humiliation while the men were drunk with celebration and Nietzsche's vigilance had lapsed. But they had underestimated their captive. Weeks of captivity had not made Eleanor weak. Her Missouri farm upbringing had given her strength, and desperation made her fierce. She fought back, clawing and kicking, no longer caring if the entire camp heard. The commotion brought Nietzsche running, and his rage was terrible to behold. He scattered the women with sharp commands, then rounded on Itza with words that needed no translation. The beautiful Apache woman spat at his feet before retreating, but the venom in her eyes promised this was not over. Nietzsche turned to Eleanor, who stood shaking by the stream, her sleeping dress torn, her feet bare and bleeding from the rocky ground. Without ceremony, he scooped her into his arms and carried her back to the wickiup. His jaw was set, his body rigid with controlled anger. Inside the shelter, he set her down gently and examined her injuries by the light of a small fire. His hands were careful as he cleaned the cuts on her feet, applied some kind of healing salve from a small pot. Eleanor watched his face, seeing the conflict there, duty warring with something else, something that made him gentle despite his anger. "This cannot continue," he said finally in Spanish. "They will kill you, no matter what I do. You must—" He paused, struggling with words or perhaps with the decision itself. "Tomorrow, the men go to raid the settlement at Willow Creek. Many warriors leave. In the confusion, a horse might go missing. A trail might lead north, toward Fort Defiance." Eleanor's breath caught. He was offering her escape, real escape, planned and aided. "Why?" she whispered. He was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the dying fire. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost vulnerable. "You remind me of someone, my sister, taken by Mexican slavers when she was young. I could not save her." He stood abruptly. "Rest. Tomorrow brings what it brings." As he left, Eleanor touched her bandaged feet, her mind reeling. Her captor had become her protector, and now possibly her savior. The fierce Apache warrior who had stolen her from her life was offering to give it back. Yet, as she lay in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the camp, she wondered why the thought of leaving created such an unexpected ache in her chest. The sound of drums still echoed faintly from the celebration, and Eleanor closed her eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring either freedom or disaster. Either way, her strange captivity among the Apache was drawing to its crisis, and the choices made in the coming hours would determine whether she lived to see home again, or whether this mountain camp would become her grave. The raid on Willow Creek never came. Instead, dawn brought news that changed everything. Soldiers had been spotted moving through the lower valleys, their numbers suggesting a major campaign. The camp erupted in controlled chaos as plans shifted from attack to defense. Nietzsche's promised opportunity for Eleanor's escape vanished like smoke in the mountain wind. That night, with the camp on edge and guards doubled, Eleanor lay wakeful in her shelter. The failed escape plan had left her oddly bereft, though whether from lost freedom or something else, she couldn't say. Outside, she could hear Nietzsche's voice among the warriors planning their response to the military threat. The sound of approaching footsteps made her close her eyes, feigning sleep as always. But these steps were unsteady, and the voice that followed was slurred with drink. something the Apache rarely indulged in. One of the warriors, emboldened by liquor traded from Mexicans, had decided to claim what Naichi had denied them all. Eleanor's eyes flew open as rough hands grabbed her. She fought, but he was strong and drunk enough to be careless with his strength. His intentions were clear as he pressed her down, muttering in Apache. Eleanor screamed, not the careful silence she'd maintained for weeks, but a true cry of terror. Naichi appeared like an avenging spirit. The confrontation was brief and violent. When it ended, the drunken warrior lay groaning on the ground, and Naichi stood over him, chest heaving, knuckles bloodied. Other warriors had gathered, drawn by the commotion, their faces grave in the firelight. An elder spoke sharply, gesturing between Naichi, Eleanor, and the injured man. The discussion that followed was heated, with various warriors taking sides. Eleanor understood enough Apache now to grasp the essence by defending her so violently. Naichi had crossed a line. The white captive was causing division in the band. Finally, the elder made a pronouncement that silenced everyone. Eleanor caught only fragments, but Naichi's face went rigid. He spoke once, a question perhaps, and the elder nodded firmly, without explanation. Naichi hauled the still groaning warrior to his feet and thrust him toward others who led him away. Then he turned to Eleanor, his expression unreadable, and spoke in Spanish. "Come." She followed him through the camp to his own wickiup, her mind racing. Inside, the shelter was sparse but clean, with weapons hung carefully on one side, blankets and personal items on the other. Naichi gestured for her to sit, then positioned himself by the entrance, his back to her. "The council has spoken," he said finally. "You caused too much trouble as a captive, so you are no longer captive." He turned to face her, his dark eyes intense. "By our law, I claim you, as wife." Eleanor's world tilted. "What?" "It is the only way," he continued, his voice carefully controlled. "As my woman, no other can touch you. You are protected by more than my word, by Apache law. But you cannot simply— Would you prefer the alternative?" His voice hardened. "They spoke of selling you to the Comancheros, or leaving you for the soldiers to find, after they are done with you." Eleanor shuddered. She had heard of the Comancheros, traders who dealt in human misery, and she knew what happened to white women who fell into the wrong hands on the frontier. Looking at Naichi, she saw not the savage of her nightmares, but a man trying to save her life within the constraints of his world. "This marriage," she said carefully. "What does it mean?" "Safety," he replied simply. "I will not force anything. You sleep there." He gestured to one side of the wickiup. "I sleep here. The others see what they need to see." It was a strange bargain, but Eleanor found herself nodding. What choice did she have? The ceremony, such as it was, took place the next night. Eleanor stood beside Naichi before the gathered band, wearing a doe-skin dress one of the older women had grudgingly provided. Words were spoken in Apache, blessings perhaps, or warnings. Naichi placed a necklace of turquoise beads around her neck. His mother's, someone whispered, and it was done. That night, in the wickiup they now shared, an awkward silence stretched between them. Eleanor sat on her designated side, still wearing the soft doe-skin dress, while Naichi tended to his weapons. Finally, she spoke. "Why did you save me? Really?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "You fought. When Itza tormented you. When the others were cruel. You fought. My sister. She was only 12 when the slavers took her. I pray she fought too. What was her name?" "Morning Star. In your language, perhaps. Dawn." Eleanor moved closer, drawn by the pain in his voice. "How long ago?" 8 winters. She would be 20 now. If she lives." Without thinking, Eleanor placed her hand on his arm. He stiffened but didn't pull away. In the dim light of the dying fire, she could see the warrior facade crack, revealing the grieving brother beneath. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in the air between them. His hand covered hers, warm and calloused from years of weapons and reins. Eleanor. It was the first time he'd said her name, and it sounded strange and beautiful in his accent. I cannot promise you an easy life, but I promise you will live. She should have pulled away, should have retreated to her side of the wickiup and maintained the careful distance between captive and captor. Instead, she found herself leaning into his warmth, exhausted by weeks of fear and pretense. I know, she said softly. He turned toward her fully then, his free hand rising to touch her face, thumb tracing the path where tears had dried. The gentleness in that touch undid something inside her. When he leaned closer, she didn't resist. Their lips met in a kiss that was tentative at first, then deeper as the weight of their strange situation pressed them together. Eleanor's mind screamed warnings. This was her captor, her enemy, a man whose people had killed settlers just like her family. But her heart recognized something else, a protector, a man who'd risked his standing among his people to keep her safe, who offered marriage to shield her from worse fates. When they finally drew apart, both were breathing unsteadily. Nietzsche rested his forehead against hers, his voice rough. This changes things. Yes, Eleanor agreed, though she wasn't sure either of them truly understood how much. That night, they slept on their separate sides of the wickiup, but the careful distance between them had dissolved. Eleanor lay awake, touching the turquoise beads at her throat, trying to reconcile the terrified captive she'd been with the woman who had just kissed an Apache warrior. In the days that followed, their strange marriage settled into a routine. To the camp, Eleanor was now Nietzsche's woman, and while not fully accepted, she was no longer tormented. Itza had retreated into cold silence, while other women began to teach Eleanor basic tasks, grudgingly showing her how to prepare foods, tan hides, recognize useful plants. Nietzsche maintained respectful boundaries, but there were moments, a hand lingering as he helped her down from a horse, eyes meeting across the evening fire. The careful way he ensured she had the warmest blankets as autumn deepened into winter. Eleanor found herself watching for his return from hunting expeditions, her heart lightening when she heard his voice. One evening, as the first snow dusted the mountain peaks, they sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. Eleanor wore Apache clothing now, her pale hair braided in their style, the turquoise beads a constant weight at her throat. "Do you ever think of going back?" Nietzsche asked suddenly in Spanish, which had become their private language. Eleanor considered the question. Back to what? Her aunt and uncle, if they lived, would never accept her now. No white man would marry a woman who'd lived among the Apache, regardless of circumstances. Sometimes, she answered honestly. But that life, that girl, she feels like someone else now. Nietzsche nodded slowly. The mountains change people, make them harder, but also more true. That night, as cold wind whistled through the peaks and the camp huddled around their fires, Eleanor made a choice. When Nietzsche entered the wickiup, she was waiting on his side of the shelter. His eyes widened in surprise, then darkened with understanding. "Eleanor, I'm your wife," she said simply. "By Apache law, by the ceremony, and now, by choice." He came to her then, and this time when they kissed, there was no hesitation. In the warmth of the firelight, with snow beginning to fall outside, Eleanor Whitfield of Missouri disappeared entirely. In her place was simply a woman who had found an unexpected haven in the arms of an unlikely protector, in a world that would condemn them both. When dawn came, painting the snow-dusted peaks in shades of pearl and pink, Eleanor woke in Nietzsche's arms. The turquoise beads were cool against her skin, and for the first time since her capture, she felt no urge to pretend sleep. Whatever came next, soldiers, winter, the judgment of two worlds that could never accept what they'd become to each other, they would face it together. The Virginia girl who'd been taken by mistake had found something she'd never expected in the harsh beauty of Apache country, a love that transcended the hatred between their peoples. fragile as spring ice but fierce as the mountain storms that raged outside their shelter. Winter held the mountains in its iron grip, and with it came a new rhythm to Eleanor's life. She had learned to wake before dawn to tend the fire, her movements automatic now in the pre-light dimness of the wickiup. Naichi would stir beside her, his arm tightening briefly around her waist before he rose to check on the horses. It was during these quiet morning moments that Eleanor first noticed the changes in her body. The nausea came in waves, forcing her to step outside into the crisp air, hoping the cold would settle her stomach. She attributed it to the change in diet, the stress of her new life. Anything but the truth that whispered at the edges of her consciousness. The Apache women noticed before she fully admitted it to herself. Their sharp eyes caught the way she turned from certain foods, how she tired more easily during the day's work. The older women exchanged knowing looks, and even Itza's hostility seemed tempered by something like pity. One morning, as Eleanor retched quietly behind the wickiup, Dahlia appeared beside her. The older woman who had first examined her with such suspicion now looked at her with something approaching kindness. "You carry his child," Dahlia said in careful Spanish. The words, spoken aloud, made it real. Eleanor's hand went instinctively to her still flat stomach as the world tilted around her. A child, Naichi's child, growing inside her even as war raged between their peoples. "Does he know?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dahlia shook her head. "Men are blind to such things until told, but he will see soon enough." Eleanor spent the day in a haze of confusion and fear. How could she bring a child into this uncertain world? A child who would belong to neither Apache nor white society, caught forever between two worlds that despised each other. That evening, as they sat by their fire, Naichi noticed her distraction. "You are troubled," he observed, setting aside the arrow he'd been fletching. Eleanor looked at him, this man who had been her captor, then protector, now husband. His face had become dear to her in ways that still surprised her. The stern warrior facade he showed others softened when they were alone, revealing humor, gentleness, and a deep intelligence that their language barrier only partially concealed. "Naichi," she began, then stopped. How did one speak such words? I am with child." His hands went very still. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he was beside her, his hands framing her face with infinite care. "You are certain?" She nodded, tears spilling over. "I'm sorry, I know this complicates." He silenced her with a kiss, gentle but fierce with emotion. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright with something she'd never seen there before, joy, pure and uncomplicated. "Sorry? You give me a child and you apologize?" He laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Eleanor, you give me more than I ever dreamed." But even as he held her, Eleanor felt the weight of what this meant. A baby would make leaving impossible, would bind her to this life irrevocably. And worse, it would create a living symbol of the union between enemies. A child who might be welcomed nowhere. The news spread through the camp like wildfire. Reactions were mixed. Some saw it as further proof that Naichi had been bewitched by the white woman, while others viewed it as a sign that perhaps the spirits blessed this strange union. The elder who had sanctioned their marriage performed a blessing ceremony, painting symbols on Eleanor's swelling belly with sacred ochre. As winter deepened, so did the danger. Scouts brought word of soldier movements, of other Apache bands being forced onto reservations. The free life Eleanor had come to know was ending, squeezed between the advancing military and the harsh winter conditions. Naichi became even more protective, barely allowing her out of his sight. He crafted a cradle board in the evenings, his hands careful as he carved protective symbols into the wood. Eleanor watched him work, her heart full of love and terror in equal measure. One night, as snow fell heavily outside their shelter, Eleanor woke to find Naichi sitting up, his body tense with listening. Voices carried on the wind. Apache, but not from their band. Raiders from another group had come seeking shelter and news. Among them was a warrior Naichi clearly knew and respected, a man named Victorio, whose reputation as a war leader preceded him. The conversation that followed, conducted in rapid Apache around the central fire, grew heated. Eleanor caught enough to understand the essence. Victorio wanted the band to join him in raids against the settlements, to strike back before they were all forced onto reservations. Naichi argued against it, and Eleanor knew why. Raids would bring retaliation, would make their precarious existence even more dangerous. And now, with a child coming, the stakes were even higher. The argument continued for days, dividing the camp. Some warriors sided with Victorio, eager to fight rather than hide. Others, particularly those with families, supported Naichi's call for caution. It was during this tense time that Eleanor felt the baby move for the first time. She gasped, her hand flying to her belly, and Naichi was instantly beside her. "What is it? Are you hurt?" "No," she breathed, wonder in her voice. "The baby, it moved." His hand joined hers, and they waited. When the flutter came again, tiny but unmistakable, his face transformed with awe. "Strong," he murmured, "like its mother, and stubborn like its father." Eleanor replied, managing a smile despite her fears. But their moment of joy was shattered by shouts from outside. Scouts had returned with dire news. A large military force was moving toward the mountains, led by a colonel known for his ruthlessness toward Apache bands. The camp erupted in activity. Those who wished to fight prepared weapons and war paint. Those who sought safety began packing, ready to flee deeper into the mountains. Naichi was torn between his roles as warrior and expectant father, his duty to his people conflicting with his need to protect his growing family. That night, as plans were debated and tempers flared, Eleanor made her own decision. She found Naichi standing apart from the others, staring out at the snow-covered peaks. "You should go with Victorio," she said quietly in Spanish. He turned to her in surprise. "What? Your people need you to fight. I see how it tears at you, staying behind while others defend the band. My place is with you, with our child." Eleanor touched his face, feeling the tension in his jaw. "And that's why I love you. But Naichi, if the soldiers come and you haven't fought, you'll never forgive yourself. Or me." He pulled her against him, his voice rough with emotion. "I cannot lose you, either of you." "You won't," she promised, though they both knew it was a promise she couldn't keep. "The women and children will hide in the deep caves. Dahlia will help me, and when you return victorious, our child will be here to greet you." He was quiet for a long moment, his internal struggle evident. Finally, he nodded slowly. 3 days. I fight for 3 days. Then I return." The next morning, Eleanor stood with the other women as the warriors prepared to leave. Naichi, painted for war and mounted on his best horse, looked every inch the Apache warrior. But his eyes, when they found hers, held all the tenderness of the man who carved lullabies into a cradle board. He leaned down from his horse, and she reached up to touch his face one last time. "Come back to us," she whispered. "Always," he promised, then wheeled his horse and was gone. Following Victorio and the others into the swirling snow, Eleanor placed her hand over her swelling belly, where their child grew safe and warm despite the chaos surrounding them. The Virginia girl taken by mistake had become an Apache wife by choice, and now she would become a mother in the midst of a war that threatened to destroy everything she'd come to love. As the war party disappeared into the white landscape, Eleanor whispered a prayer to any god who might listen, Apache, Christian, or otherwise, that Naichi would return to see their child born, that somehow their impossible love might survive in this harsh and beautiful land that had become her home. The 3 days stretched into a week, then 2. Eleanor moved through her tasks mechanically, her worry growing with each passing sunset that failed to bring the warriors home. The women whispered of battles, of soldiers with repeating rifles, of Apache bodies left in the snow. Each rumor was a knife to her heart, despite the fear that gnawed at her. Eleanor found unexpected solidarity among the Apache women. Her pregnancy had shifted something in their perception of her. She was no longer just the white captive who had bewitched Naichi. She was a woman carrying an Apache child, facing the same fears they all faced when their men rode to war. Dahlia took her under her wing, teaching her the prayers Apache women sang for protection, showing her how to prepare the special foods that would give her strength during childbirth. Even some of the younger women who had shunned her began to include her in their work, their chatter a welcome distraction from worry. One afternoon, as Eleanor helped scrape a hide, a young mother named Rosa spoke to her in halting Spanish. "First baby is always frightening, but you are strong. Naichi chose well." The unexpected kindness brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. "Thank you," she managed. "Apache or white, all mothers fear the same." Rosa continued, bouncing her own infant on her hip. "We pray together." Yes? It was Itza who surprised Eleanor most. The beautiful woman who had tormented her appeared one morning with a bundle of soft rabbit skins. "For the baby," she said stiffly in Apache, which Eleanor now understood well enough. No child should suffer for the choices of parents. Eleanor accepted the gift with genuine gratitude. "I never wanted to come between you and Naichi." Itza's laugh was bitter. "He was never mine to lose. I see that now. His spirit called to yours from the moment he brought you here." She paused, then added quietly, "Care for him well, white woman. He is a good man." As the days passed with no word, the camp's mood grew increasingly tense. Scouts reported military patrols drawing closer, systematically searching the mountain valleys. The elders decided to move the women and children to the hidden caves deeper in the mountains, places known only to the Apache where they had sheltered for generations. The journey was arduous, especially for Eleanor in her condition. The paths were treacherous with ice and snow, winding through passages so narrow that horses had to be led single file. Her back ached constantly, and the baby seemed to protest the difficult travel with increased movement. They reached the caves as another storm rolled in, the wind howling like grieving spirits through the peaks. The caves were surprisingly warm and dry, with the natural springs providing water and generations of use leaving them well supplied with stored goods. Eleanor had just settled into an exhausted sleep when shouts echoed through the cavern. Warriors were returning, but only a handful, wounded and defeated. Her heart stopped as she searched desperately for Naichi among them. He wasn't there. A young warrior named Kayita, his arm bound in bloody cloth, delivered the news. The battle had gone badly. Soldiers with mountain howitzers had caught them in a valley, the big guns turning Apache mobility into a trap. Many had fallen. Victorio had led survivors one way. Naichi had taken others another direction, trying to draw pursuit away from the camps. "He lives?" Eleanor asked desperately in Apache, no longer caring about revealing her understanding. Kayita nodded wearily. "Last I saw, but soldiers follow close. He leads them away from here." Eleanor felt Rosa's hand on her shoulder, steadying her as the cave seemed to spin. Naichi lived, but he was being hunted, deliberately drawing danger away from his pregnant wife and his people. Days blended together in the caves. Eleanor learned to read the signs, how sound echoed differently when storms approached, which springs ran warmest, where the smoke holes drew best. She helped tend the wounded, her basic healing knowledge from farm life proving useful. The work kept her hands busy while her heart ached with worry. It was during a quiet moment, as she sorted herbs with Dahlia, that the older woman spoke of things Eleanor had only guessed at. "Naichi's father was a great chief," Dahlia said. "He could have claimed leadership when the old man died, but he chose differently, said his path was not to lead but to protect." "Why tell me this?" Eleanor asked. "So you understand what he does now, leading soldiers away. This is who he is, not because you are white or Apache, but because you are his to protect." That night, Eleanor dreamed of Naichi. He stood in the snow, warriors at his side, facing a line of blue-coated soldiers. But in the dream, she stood with him, their child in her arms, and the two lines of enemies lowered their weapons in wonder at the sight of a family that shouldn't exist. She woke to commotion. More warriors had arrived, And with them, miraculously, was Naichi. Eleanor pushed through the crowd, her swollen belly making her clumsy, until she saw him. He was haggard, his clothes torn, a gash along his ribs, but alive. Their eyes met across the cave, and he moved toward her like a man in a dream. When he reached her, his hands went first to her belly, feeling the firm roundness, assuring himself that both she and the child were safe. "Eleanor," he breathed, and she fell into his arms, not caring who watched. But their reunion was brief. Naichi brought dire news. The army was implementing a new strategy. Rather than chase war parties through the mountains, they were systematically destroying Apache food stores, killing game, poisoning water sources. They meant to starve the people into submission. "We cannot stay here," he told the gathered council. "The caves protected our grandparents, but against this kind of war?" He shook his head. Arguments erupted. Some wanted to scatter, each family finding its own path. Others spoke of surrender, of accepting reservation life rather than watching children starve. A few diehards called for more raids, more war. Eleanor watched Naichi during these debates, seeing the weight of impossible choices in his eyes. That night, as they lay together in their small alcove of the cave, she voiced what she'd seen. "You're thinking of surrender," she said quietly. His arm tightened around her. "I think of our child. What life can I give? Always running, always hiding." "Any life with you is better than a life without," Eleanor said firmly. He turned to study her face in the dim light. "Even on a reservation? Watched by soldiers, told when to plant, when to hunt, when to pray?" "Even then," she confirmed, though the thought of cages, for that's what reservations were, made her heart ache. "The agent at San Carlos, he is said to be less cruel than others. If we came in peace, with families." Naichi trailed off. Eleanor understood the unspoken concern. She was still technically a captive. Whatever their Apache marriage meant, the authorities would demand her release, would never acknowledge their union or allow their child to remain with its father. "We'll face that when we must," she said, together. But fate had other plans. The next morning, scouts reported soldiers at the base of the mountain, not searching randomly now, but moving with purpose toward the caves. Someone, perhaps a captured Apache or a paid informant, had revealed their location. There was no time for debate. The band scattered like quail before a hawk. Naichi lifted Eleanor onto his gentlest horse, swinging up behind her, one arm protective around her swollen middle. "Where do we go?" she asked as they joined the stream of fleeing people. "Away," he said grimly. "As far and fast as we can." But Eleanor knew, as did he, that there was nowhere left to run. The old world, the free world of the Apache, was ending. Their child would be born into captivity, or worse, into a world where its very existence was an affront to the racial boundaries both societies demanded. As they rode through the swirling snow, Eleanor leaned back against Naichi's chest, feeling their child move within her. Whatever came next, reservation, separation, or something worse, they had this moment, a white woman and an Apache warrior, bound by love and the life growing between them, riding through a landscape as beautiful and doomed as their unlikely union. Behind them, smoke began to rise from the sacred caves as soldiers destroyed what generations of Apache had built. Ahead lay only uncertainty, but Eleanor found, to her surprise, that she was no longer afraid. She had chosen her path on that long-ago night when she accepted Naichi's kiss, and she would follow it wherever it led. "No regrets?" Naichi asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Eleanor placed her hand over his where it rested on her belly. "None," she said, and meant it. The end came at dawn on a bitter February morning. Eleanor woke to the thunder of hooves and the sharp crack of rifle fire. Cavalry had surrounded their makeshift camp in the night, and now blue-coated soldiers poured down from the ridges like an avalanche. "Run!" Naichi shouted, pushing Eleanor toward the trees while he grabbed his rifle. Around them, the camp exploded into chaos, women screaming, children crying, warriors rushing to mount whatever defense they could against overwhelming numbers. Eleanor ran, her swollen belly making her clumsy, branches tearing at her clothes. Behind her, she could hear Naichi firing, his voice raised in a war cry that made her blood run cold. The baby kicked frantically within her, as if sensing the danger. A soldier appeared in her path, his rifle raised. Eleanor froze, seeing her death in the young man's eyes. Then his gaze dropped to her obvious pregnancy, to her pale skin beneath the Apache clothing, and confusion replaced determination. "Ma'am?" he said uncertainly. "Ma'am, are you—" Naichi's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Eleanor's husband materialized beside her, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, his eyes wild with battle fury. "Go!" he commanded, pushing her forward, but there was nowhere to go. Soldiers were everywhere, their disciplined volleys cutting down Apache warriors who fought with desperate courage. Eleanor saw Cayeta fall, saw Rosa running with her baby clutched to her chest, saw old Dahlia standing proud and defiant as soldiers surrounded her. "Naichi!" Eleanor gasped. "We have to—" The bullet took him in the side, spinning him half around. He staggered but kept his feet, still trying to shield her with his body. Another bullet found his thigh, and he went down to one knee. "No!" Eleanor screamed, catching him as he fell. His blood was hot on her hands, soaking through her dress. Too much blood, flowing too fast. Around them, the battle was ending. Apache warriors lay still in the snow, their resistance crushed by superior numbers and firepower. The surviving women and children huddled together, surrounded by soldiers whose faces showed a mixture of triumph and unease at what they'd done. Eleanor cradled Naichi's head in her lap, pressing her hands uselessly against his wounds. His eyes found hers, still aware, still fierce, despite the pain. "Eleanor," he whispered, his hand reaching up to touch her face. "My heart—" "Don't," she sobbed. "Don't you dare leave us. Our baby needs you. I need you." A shadow fell over them. Eleanor looked up to see a cavalry officer, his uniform marking him as a captain. His face was weathered, his eyes hard, but something in them softened as he took in the scene. A white woman in Apache dress, heavy with child, holding a dying warrior. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'm Captain Morrison. We need to get you to safety." "Help him," Eleanor begged. "Please, he's my husband. Help him." The captain's face hardened. "Ma'am, that's an Apache warrior. He's killed. He's my husband," Eleanor shrieked, her composure finally shattering. "We were married by their customs. This is his child. Please." The captain gestured to a sergeant. "Get the surgeon, now." "Sir?" The sergeant looked shocked. "For an Apache." "That's an order. Sergeant." The camp surgeon, a thin man with tired eyes, examined Naichi with professional detachment. He worked quickly, stuffing wounds with lint, binding them tightly. But Eleanor could read the truth in his face. "The bleeding's too severe," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, ma'am." Eleanor bent over Naichi, her tears falling on his face. He managed to lift his hand to her belly one last time. "Name." He struggled to speak. "If boy, Samuel. Your people's name. If girl, Morningstar. For my sister, Naichi," Eleanor sobbed. "Live," he whispered. "Both of you, live." His hand fell away. The fierce light in his dark eyes dimmed, then went out entirely. Eleanor felt something tear inside her chest, a pain worse than any physical wound. She threw back her head and keened, not the restrained grief of a white woman, but the full-throated wail of Apache mourning. The sound sent shivers through the soldiers. Here was their proof of how far she'd fallen. This white woman who grieved an Apache warrior like a true wife. Captain Morrison let her mourn for a few minutes before speaking again. "Ma'am, we need to move. Where are your people? Your family?" Eleanor looked at him with eyes that had aged decades in moments. "Dead," she said flatly. "Or thinking me so. The baby," as if in response to his words. Eleanor gasped as a contraction rippled across her belly. The stress, the running, the grief. Her body had decided that now, in this place of death, surrounded by enemies, was the time to bring forth life, "The baby's coming," she whispered. Then louder as another pain hit. "The baby's coming now!" The captain cursed. "Surgeon!" What followed was a blur of pain and confusion. They carried Eleanor to a wagon. Apache women prisoners allowed to attend her since no white woman was available. It was Itza who held her hand, who whispered encouragement in Apache as Eleanor labored to bring Naichi's child into a world that had just killed its father. The baby came with the setting sun. A girl, small but fierce, her first cry piercing the cold air like a warrior's call. She had her father's dark hair, her mother's pale skin, and when she opened her eyes, they were a striking gray, neither fully Apache nor white, but something entirely her own. "Morning Star," Eleanor whispered, holding her daughter for the first time. "Your father named you Morning Star." Captain Morrison stood awkwardly nearby, clearly unsure how to handle this situation. "Ma'am, we'll take you to Fort Grant. There are good people there who can—" "Who can what?" Eleanor interrupted, her voice hard. "Take my daughter from me. Put her in a school to beat the Apache out of her? Tell me I'm unfit to raise her because I loved her father?" The captain had no answer. The journey to Fort Grant took 3 days. Eleanor rode in the wagon with the other prisoners, holding Morning Star close, surrounded by the remnants of Naichi's band. The Apache women helped her care for the baby, showing her how to wrap Morning Star in the traditional way, how to read her different cries. At night, when they made camp, Eleanor could hear the soldiers talking about her, about the squaw man's widow, about what should be done with the half-breed baby. Their words were knives, but Eleanor endured them. She had endured worse. At Fort Grant, they were separated. The Apache prisoners were herded toward holding areas, while Eleanor was taken to the commander's office. Colonel William Brennan was a stern man with gray whiskers and tired eyes. "Miss Whitfield," he began, reading from a report. "Taken captive August last year. Your uncle has been notified. He's been searching for you." "Mrs. Naichi," Eleanor corrected firmly. "And this is my daughter, Morning Star Naichi." The colonel's face tightened. "Miss Whitfield, you've been through a terrible ordeal. No one blames you for what happened while you were a captive. But now you're safe. We can help you return to civilization, find a good family for the child." "She has a family," Eleanor interrupted. "She has me. A half-breed child will have no place in proper society," the colonel said, not unkindly. "Surely you must see that. There are missions that take such children, raise them properly." Eleanor stood. Morning Star clutched to her chest. "Colonel, I buried my husband yesterday. He died protecting us. I will not dishonor his memory by giving away our child. If you try to take her, I'll fight you with every breath in my body." The colonel studied her for a long moment. This young woman who looked like she should be attending church socials but spoke with the fierce determination of an Apache mother. "Your uncle arrives tomorrow," he said finally. "Perhaps he can talk sense into you." That night, Eleanor sat by the window of the small room they'd given her, looking out at the stars. Morning Star fussed, and Eleanor opened her dress to nurse her, singing softly, not the lullabies of her Missouri childhood, but the Apache songs Dahlia had taught her. Tomorrow would bring new battles. Her uncle would come with his expectations and judgments. Society would condemn her choices. The world would try to tear her daughter away, to erase Naichi's legacy. But tonight, she had her daughter. Tonight, Morning Star carried proof that love could bloom even in the harshest ground, that two peoples who were supposed to be enemies could create something beautiful together. "Your father was a good man," she whispered to the baby. "Whatever they say, whatever lies they tell, remember that. He was a good man who loved us both." Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, or perhaps it was an Apache signal. Eleanor chose to believe that, somewhere, Naiche's spirit heard his daughter's first cries and was at peace. The war was over. The Apache were defeated. But in her arms, Eleanor held a different kind of victory. A child who would grow up knowing that love was stronger than hate, that courage came in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion was simply refusing to let go of what the world said you couldn't have. Morning Star slept, and Eleanor kept watch. ready to face whatever tomorrow brought in defense of Nietzsche's daughter, their daughter, the living proof that even in the darkest times, hope could take root and bloom. The morning sun cast long shadows through the fort's windows as Eleanor waited for her uncle's arrival. Morningstar slept peacefully in her arms, unaware of the storm about to break over their heads. Through the thin walls, Eleanor could hear the whispers of soldiers and their wives, savage lover, ruined woman, that half-breed infant. When Thomas Whitfield entered the commander's office, Eleanor barely recognized him. The months had aged him, carved deep lines of grief and worry into his weathered face. His eyes, when they found her, filled with tears. "Eleanor," he breathed. "Child, we thought you were dead." For a moment, Eleanor's resolve wavered. This man had been like a father to her, had taken her in when her own parents died, but then his gaze fell on Morningstar, and his face hardened. "What have they done to you?" he whispered. "They saved me," Eleanor said firmly. "When I was taken, I expected death or worse. Instead, I found—" She paused, searching for words he might understand. "I found a different kind of life. Uncle, and a man who protected me, who married me by his people's customs." "Married?" Thomas's voice rose. "Eleanor, whatever those savages made you do, no one made me do anything." Eleanor interrupted. "I chose Nietzsche. I chose to be his wife. And this is our daughter, Morningstar." The silence that followed was deafening. Colonel Brennan shifted uncomfortably behind his desk, while Thomas stared at his niece as if she'd grown a second head. "You chose," Thomas finally managed. "Eleanor, you're not thinking clearly. The ordeal you've been through—" "Sit down, Uncle," Eleanor said quietly. "Let me tell you the truth. Not the story you've built in your mind, but what actually happened." For the next hour, Eleanor spoke. She told him about her capture, about the fear that had nearly consumed her. She spoke of Nietzsche's protection, of learning to see the Apache as people rather than monsters. She described their marriage, her growing love for a man who sacrificed everything to keep her safe. And finally, with tears streaming down her face, she told him how Nietzsche died protecting them. Thomas listened in stone-faced silence. When she finished, he stood abruptly. "You're coming home with me," he said. "We'll tell people you were injured in the raid, that your mind was affected. The child. We'll say it's from a first marriage, that your husband died going west. In time, people will forget." "I won't lie about my daughter's father," Eleanor said. "I won't teach her to be ashamed of who she is. Then you condemn her to a life of misery." Thomas exploded. "No decent man will have you. No school will take her. She'll be scorned, spat upon, like her people are now?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Uncle, I've seen how decent society treats those who are different. I won't raise my daughter to hate half of herself." The argument continued for hours, growing more heated as both refused to yield. Finally, Colonel Brennan intervened. "There is another matter," he said reluctantly. "The Apache prisoners. Many are to be sent to the reservation at San Carlos. Some of the women have asked. They want to know if you'll come with them." Eleanor's heart leaped. "The survivors of Nietzsche's band? What's left of them?" The colonel confirmed. "They say you're one of them now, that the child belongs with her father's people as much as her mother's." "Absolutely not," Thomas roared. "I won't have my niece living on some reservation like an Apache," Eleanor finished. "Uncle, that's what I am now. Not by blood, but by choice, by marriage, by the child I carry. I can't go back to being the girl who left Missouri. That girl is gone." That night, Eleanor was granted permission to visit the Apache prisoners. She found them in a heavily guarded building, women and children huddled together in the cold. When she entered carrying Morningstar, a cry went up. The women surrounded her, reaching out to touch the baby, speaking rapid Apache. Itza pushed forward, her face gaunt from poor rations, but her eyes fierce. "You come with us?" Eleanor nodded, tears flowing. "If they let me." "They will," Dahlia said with certainty. You are the widow of Nietzsche. Your child is Apache. We will speak for you. Over the following days, a legal battle ensued. Thomas threatened to have Eleanor declared incompetent, to take custody of Morningstar. But Eleanor found an unexpected ally in Captain Morrison, the officer who had allowed the surgeon to treat Nietzsche. I saw them together. He testified to the federal agent overseeing the Apache removal. Whatever else you might think, she loved that warrior, and he died protecting her. Seems to me she has the right to choose where she raises their child. The Apache women spoke as well. Through interpreters, they told of Eleanor's marriage, recognized by their laws. They spoke of her work in the camp, her efforts to learn their ways. Most powerfully, old Dahlia stood and declared that Eleanor had earned her place among them through pain and love and loss. That to separate her from the people would be one more cruelty in a long list of cruelties. In the end, perhaps worn down by the unusual nature of the case, the authorities granted Eleanor permission to accompany the Apache to San Carlos if she wished. The alternative, they made clear, was to return to her uncle and never speak of her time with the Apache again. Eleanor's choice was never in doubt. The day before the removal, Thomas came one last time. He looked older, defeated. Your aunt is dead, he said bluntly. Died thinking you were gone. I buried her next to the markers we put up for you. Eleanor felt the loss like a physical blow, but she didn't waver. I'm sorry for your pain, Uncle, for both of you, but I can't live a lie to ease it. You're throwing your life away, he said. For what? For people who aren't even yours? Eleanor looked down at Morningstar, who was beginning to fuss for her feeding. They are mine, Uncle, more than blood could ever make them. Nietzsche gave his life for us. The least I can do is give our daughter a chance to know both her peoples. Thomas left without saying goodbye. Eleanor never saw him again. The journey to San Carlos was hard. Weeks of travel in army wagons. Poor food. Sickness running through the group. Eleanor walked more than she rode, giving her place to elderly women and children. Morningstar traveled strapped to her back in the cradleboard Nietzsche had made, protected from sun and dust. At night, around carefully guarded fires, the Apache women taught Eleanor the songs she would need to know to raise her daughter properly. They told stories of the old days, of freedom in the mountains, ensuring that Morningstar would grow up knowing what had been lost. And they spoke of Nietzsche, keeping his memory alive in the tradition of their people. San Carlos was a shock, a piece of desert that seemed chosen for its complete inability to sustain life. The Apache were expected to farm in soil that wouldn't grow stones, to live in a land so different from their mountains that many sickened just from the change. Eleanor took her place among them without complaint. She learned to make do with government rations, to build shelters from whatever materials they could find. When Morningstar grew sick from the bad water, Eleanor fought the agency doctor to get proper medicine, using her white skin as a weapon when necessary to protect her child. Years passed. Eleanor became a bridge between two worlds, helping the Apache navigate the bureaucracy that controlled their lives while never forgetting who she had chosen to be. Morningstar grew into a beautiful child who spoke both Apache and English, who knew her father's stories and her mother's lullabies. Sometimes, late at night, Eleanor would hold her daughter and tell her about Nietzsche, about his courage, his gentleness, the way he carved symbols of protection into her cradleboard. She told Morningstar that she was born of love that crossed impossible boundaries, that her very existence was proof that understanding could bloom even in the midst of war. Your father named you for his sister, Eleanor would say. But you're also named for hope. You're the morning star that rises after the darkest night, the light that promises a new day will come. The reservation life was hard, often heartbreaking, but Eleanor had found her place, among people who had accepted her when her own world would have cast her out. She had kept her promise to Nietzsche. She lived. Their daughter lived. And the love that had bloomed in the harsh beauty of Apache country lived on in Morningstar's eyes, in the stories passed down, in the refusal to let hatred have the final word. In the end, The Apache hadn't taken the young virgin by mistake. They had given a lost girl a chance to find herself, to discover that home isn't always where you're born, but sometimes where you choose to stand. And Eleanor stood with the Apache, raising a daughter who would grow up knowing that love was stronger than prejudice, that family was more than blood, and that sometimes the greatest courage was simply refusing to be anything other than who you truly were. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love and survival in the Wild West. I'm curious to know where in the world you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect with fellow listeners around the globe. If you enjoyed Eleanor and Nietzsche's journey, don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales of the American frontier. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments. What touched you most about their forbidden love? Your feedback means everything to us.